Okay, so I wanted to pick up from something that Xavier said. And he said he thought he was never going to see anything that could look a little bit like 1929. And it is true that not that long ago, when you talked about the Great Depression, something would happen in the eyes of your graduate students, and it was a little bit like telling them about the early stages of the Roman civil wars. Certainly is unbelievably far away, completely irrelevant, and at best of anecdotal interest. Now, having said that, I think there's the good news is now that the range of years that are relevant for thinking about issues has become a little bit longer again. We actually have more data. We can actually find out more things. And one of the things that I saw Brad DeLong on a panel like this not that long ago, and he said, currently the words that will strike fear into the hearts of any congressman or senator you talk to in Washington is, me as an economic historian, I can tell you, that sounds like a very bad idea based on everything I know about the Great Depression. All of a sudden, this knowledge seems to be relevant. Now, having said that, we actually know how to stop financial crises. We're very good at stopping banking crises. That's not hard at all. We did that following the last big meltdown, and it worked brilliantly for about 40 years. We invented a system that had no crises. And the downside was that it also did a terrible job at transferring resources. It kept out new entrants. It kept margins very high. It wasn't associated with low rates of growth. The 1950s and 1960s in Europe had pretty high rates of growth. But we thought there were all sorts of other things wrong with it. And I think, just like every human being, we're very bad at learning from things that happen with very low frequency. We learn well from things that bring rewards and punishment very quickly, that get repeated very often. Crises that happen every 60 or 70 years are something very difficult to evaluate in terms of what the right policy is. And I think there's a very real danger that we throw the baby out with the bathwater again and try to say this is too painful. We'll avoid it, and we're not actually going to think about the benefits that come from year after year having slightly higher growth rates, for example. And thinking about that trade-off and so forth, I think, is a tricky question. There's nice work by Romain Rancière, for example, that actually looks at issues of what's the trade-off here and how should we actually approach this in welfare terms. But I think there's a real danger in terms of public backlash here.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments from the audience? Okay, let me just ask a quick question to Joachim, since you have specialized in providing the long-term perspective on these things. So, and it would be also good to end with a somewhat positive note, the session.
I didn't know I specialized in that. But.
Do you think we have learned something since 1930?
Oh. So, contrary to my reputation for being a specialist in all things historical, the history of economic thought is not one of my specialities. So, occasionally, you find yourself stranded over dinner right next to some colleague who's normally not a specialist in the history of economic thought, and if you reveal yourself as an economic historian, they will immediately delve into the finer points of Ricardo's argument in 1934, and you have to terribly disappoint them by saying that you're not familiar with them. So, have we learned something as a profession since 1930? Emphatically, yes, of course we have. Many of the things that Krugman has to say about the great forgetting and how we don't understand the first thing about what drives business cycles and crises and the role of money and so forth is plain silly. I think that's sort of instrumentalizing the current crisis for what you can perhaps describe as a very low form of academic politics. I'm surprised you didn't ask me whether we learned anything since 1936, the date of publication of the general theory. Because that's clearly a step ahead that a few people, even of that conviction, would sort of put a question mark behind. But now, I don't even know where to start in terms of saying talking about the things that we understand. It is true that we, as a field, become incredibly technical, but I think this is a normal hog cycle ebb and flow, where in some periods you prove your worth more by being very clever with stuff that's tricky and hard to solve in a technical sense, and then there are periods when there's real demand for ideas. And I don't see that any change in preference justifies this verdict of damnation that comes from certain corners.
Any further thoughts? Any questions? Okay, well, I thank you very much to all the panelists.